Hi everybody, we're going to continue reading Who Let the Gods Out. We're going to pick up from chapter 4 being called Mum's the Word. Be sure to read chapters 1, 2 and 3 before reading or listening to this one. We're going to jump in. Elliot didn't know what to do. He couldn't find Mum anywhere, and now it was completely dark. He considered calling the police, but what about if they found Mum before he did? Where could she have gone this time? He ran into the kitchen for the 10th time, trying to keep the sickening panic at bay. He would find her. He always did. And with that reassuring thought, he finally noticed her pink gardening gloves on the kitchen table. He grabbed his coat and his mum's and headed to the fields. He ran across the farm, and he could just about make out a figure in the darkness up ahead. He breathed a sigh of relief. There was Mum, kneeling on the grass, happily planting vegetables in the empty field. On his approach, he could hear her chatting to the empty space and occasionally breaking out into a cheery song. He remembered a time when his mum seemed so much bigger than him, when one of her hugs would completely smother him in a warm embrace of rose-scented love. "I blew into England on a breeze," she would giggle in an accent that wasn't familiar, but also wasn't too strange. It made her seem almost magical. But these days, she seemed to be so fragile, so small, and so old. Elliot wished he had asked more about her life when he had the chance. Elliot hurried over to where Mum was busily digging and slipped her coat over her shoulders. She turned around, and her face shone in 100 places, as it always did when she saw him. She pushed his messy brown hair out of his face and reached up to give her boy a hug. "So, how was your day?" she smiled. "Really, really great," Elliot lied. "Top of the class in history." "You're so clever, Ellie," she laughed, rubbing a small smudge of soil onto his nose. "I must take after you, Mum," he said with a chuckle. "So what are you He stopped when he realised what his mother was doing. A packet of unopened carrot seeds lay beside her while she was putting the final loving touches on planting a row of clothes pegs instead. Elliot's heart plummeted. She was doing it again. "Come on, Mum. It's getting cold. Let's go inside." Elliot helped her up gently and guided her back towards the house. He then settled her in the lounge, lit a fire, and went into the kitchen to prepare their supper. Elliot couldn't pinpoint exactly when his mum started acting strangely. She'd always been strange, but in a good way. Dancing around the streets, doing handstands in shops, but something recently had changed. The last year had passed in such a blur, first the worrying of Nan and Grandad getting ill, then them dying, that he hadn't even really noticed Mum's odd behaviour until only a few months ago. It began with small things. She'd lose something that she had 2 minutes ago, or she couldn't remember the name of a person or a place. At first, Elliot thought it was the normal short circuits of a stressed mind, but then the memory lapses soon became more and more serious, forgetting that there was food in the oven or leaving the bath running. Then, one day, Elliot came home from school and saw that his mum was nowhere to be found. He ran down the path to the village and found her in the middle of the road in a nightdress, lost and confused, with no idea where she lived. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Mum needed help. By doing all the shopping, cooking and housework, Elliot had convinced himself that everything was going to be okay. But deep down, he knew his mum needed a doctor. Josie's mind was unwell, and it was getting worse. But it wasn't that simple. What if the doctor said she was too ill to look after him? What if they took her away? What would happen to Elliot then? Elliot had no other family. He didn't even know his dad. Elliot and his mother had always lived with their grandparents, and Elliot only knew 2 things about his father: that he had given Elliot a pocket watch when he was a baby, and that he just wasn't there now. Elliot never knew where he had gone or why, and whenever he asked, his mum would get upset and say, "You're too young to understand." "Now's not the time," she used to say, holding his face in her hands. One day I'll explain everything." Elliot wasn't sure if this day was ever going to come now. Besides, his mother and grandparents made him so happy that his dad could never match this. His dad obviously didn't care about him. So he wasn't going to care back. Elliot quickly checked his pocket to make sure that his watch hadn't fallen out when he had ran outside. No, it was better this way. Mum had looked after him all of his life, and now it was his turn to look after her. If he could just keep everyone else's nose out, they'd be fine. Elliot opened the kitchen cupboard, even though he knew exactly what it contained. A box of tea bags, some small stale digestives, 3 tins of beans, and half a loaf of bread. He looked in the chip cookie jar that guarded their weekly spending money and counted the remaining £3.76 inside. He put the £20 he had borrowed from Mrs. Porchley Plum's handbag into the jar and added an IOU to the other, reminding him that he needed to pay some people back. He had to borrow a lot of money lately. There were a lot of IOUs in the jar. Nan and Grandad never trusted the banks, and the farm used to provide all the food, so they kept their life savings in a tin under the bed. Elliot was careful to use as little money as he possibly could, but he knew it was running out, and there were only so many vegetables Mum could grow. Over time, the farm workers had left, and the animals were eventually sold, all except Bessie, the lame cow Elliot had raised from a calf who lived in a derelict cowshed across the paddock. Elliot's early morning paper round brought in a bit of money, but it was barely enough for the essentials, let alone the expensive things he needed for school. He remembered Mr. Boyle's moan about his uniform and made a mental note to sew on some buttons onto his only shirt and to polish his shoes that had started to become too tight way back in Easter. Beans on toast all right for tea, Mum? He called through to the lounge. Lovely, baby boy. Haven't had that for a while, she replied cheerfully. Mum's forgetfulness worried Elliot a lot. But if it stopped her from remembering that beans on toast had been their supper every night for the past 3 weeks, perhaps it wasn't all bad. He made the meal and they snuggled in front of their small black and white TV to watch the cooking competition Mum enjoyed on Friday nights. She used to be an amazing cook, and Elliot laughed as she colourfully insulted the contestants' cooking efforts. I wouldn't serve that with a tennis racket, she yelled at one woman's attempt at a baked Alaska. But by 9 o'clock, Mum was falling asleep in her chair. She slept a lot in those days. Elliot gently woke her and helped her upstairs. He laid her nightdress out on the bed, left her to get changed, and came back in to say good night. And where would they go? They had no one and nowhere. Mum was confused enough in the home she spent all of her adult life. There was no way she was going to cope with somewhere new. Elliot picked up another letter from the electricity company. We regret to inform you that due to non-payment of your outstanding balance, your service will be terminated on... The rest was lost as the house suddenly plunged into darkness. Obviously, their electricity has been cut off because they didn't pay right at that moment when Elliot was reading the letter. Elliot pulled out the torch, candles and matches he kept nearby for every time the electricity was cut off, and did some rough sums on the back of his maths homework. He could pay the electricity bill tomorrow. Thank you, Mrs. Porchley Plum, but that would only leave £5 or so for next week's food. But next week would have to take care of itself. Elliot quietly vowed that if he ever became rich, he would never eat a single baked bean again. Elliot then looked out of the window into the night sky. With no light pollution from his house, the stars sparkled in the darkness. He smiled as he remembered how he and his mum used to climb on top of the cowshed roof to look at the constellations. Tonight you could see the V shape of Pisces, which ruled the sky in November. At other times in the year, he could recognize other shapes: the circle formed by Aquarius, the kite shape of Scorpio, and the triangular shape of Libra. But there couldn't be any other constellations out tonight, although he was sure he could see the rectangular shape. in the stars of Virgo. But that didn't make any sense. What was it doing in the sky at this time of year? And why was it moving? An aeroplane suddenly roared overhead. Had it hit the constellation of Virgo? It looked like it. And was Virgo... what? He scoffed at this impossible idea. Stars couldn't fall out of the sky. Elliot stared into the darkness as the stars hurtled through the sky. Were they shooting stars? No, more like tumbling stars. They were definitely dropping. He peered into the night. He was right. The stars were falling, and every second they came nearer and gathered speed and became bigger. The stars were out of control. What were they going to hit? His question was quickly answered by an almighty bang a few meters from his window. The stars came crashing to the ground right in the middle of the cowshed. Right, year 5, that's the end of chapter 4. We'll pick up chapter 5 next week. This is the end of this chapter. Sure sounds like some things are going to be happening. It looks like Virgo may have landed at Elliot's farm.